The wind howled through the empty streets, carrying with it sharp ice crystals that cut through the night like tiny blades. The city was silent, covered in a thick blanket of snow that turned everything into a frozen wasteland. Streetlights flickered, casting a dim glow on the deserted sidewalks. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, the kind that turned the world into an unforgiving place for anyone left out in it. And in the middle of it all, lying motionless near the curb, was a German shepherd, abandoned, freezing, and barely clinging to life. His body was weak, his once thick and proud coat now matted with frost and dirt. His ribs pressed against his thin fur, and his breath came out in slow, faint puffs of steam, barely visible in the frigid air. Every second, the cold pulled him deeper into exhaustion. His body too weak to fight anymore, he had wandered for days, searching for warmth, for food, for someone who would care. But no one had stopped. No one had looked twice. And now, as the snow piled up around him, it seemed like this was where it would all end. Just a few blocks away, Daniel Carter was making his way home, his hands stuffed deep into his coat pockets. His boots crunched against the icy pavement as he walked, his breath heavy in the freezing air. It had been another long day at the auto shop. His hands were stiff from hours of working on frozen engines, and all he wanted was to get back to his cabin, throw some logs into the fireplace, and forget about the world for a while. Life hadn't been easy lately, and tonight, more than anything, he just wanted to shut everything out. But then, something caught his eye. At first, it looked like just another pile of trash left behind, half buried in the snow. But as he got closer, his stomach tightened. It wasn't trash. It was a dog, a German shepherd, curled up and barely moving. Daniel stopped in his tracks, staring at the motionless figure. Strays weren't uncommon in the city. He'd seen plenty of them over the years, and yet something about this one made him hesitate. Maybe it was the way the dog's body lay so still, as if it had already given up. Or maybe it was the faint rise and fall of its chest, so weak it was barely noticeable. For a moment, Daniel considered walking away. He wasn't in the business of rescuing animals. He had enough problems of his own, and he wasn't looking to take on more. But as he turned to leave, something inside him wouldn't let him move. He gritted his teeth, torn between logic and the nagging feeling in his chest. With a deep breath, he stepped forward and crouched beside the dog. His gloved hand reached out hesitantly, brushing against the frozen fur. Ice clung to the shepherd's coat, and his body was as cold as the snow around him. Was he too late? Was there even a chance? Then, just as Daniel was about to pull away, the dog let out a weak, shaky breath. "You're not dead yet, huh?" Daniel muttered, more to himself than to the dog. For a few seconds, he just knelt there, debating what to do next. The logical part of his brain told him to walk away. This wasn't his problem, and he had no idea if the dog would even survive the night. But another part of him, the part that refused to ignore what was right in front of him, wouldn't let him leave. With a sigh, Daniel slipped his arms under the shepherd's limp body. The dog barely reacted, too far gone to resist. He wasn't heavy, too thin, too weak to put up a fight. Daniel grunted as he stood, adjusting his grip. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he started walking, the freezing wind cutting through his coat. The cabin wasn't far, but with every step, he wondered if he was making a mistake. What if the dog didn't survive? What if he was wasting his time? But then, as he neared his home, something unexpected happened. The dog, who had been nothing but a lifeless weight in his arms, let out the faintest whimper. It was weak, barely more than a whisper against the night air. But it was there. Daniel glanced down, and for the first time, he saw it. The flicker of life still left in the dog's tired eyes. And in that moment, he knew. He couldn't walk away now. But what Daniel didn't know was that this night, this decision, would change everything for both of them. Because what happened next was something no one could have expected. Inside the cabin, the warmth hit Daniel like a wave as he pushed the door shut behind him. The fire in the wood stove had burned low while he was gone, but even the lingering heat was a stark contrast to the freezing air outside. He carried the German Shepherd carefully across the small living room, lowering him onto an old folded-up blanket near the fireplace. The dog barely moved, his breathing shallow, his body stiff from the cold. Daniel crouched beside him, running a hand through his damp, ice-covered fur. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" he muttered. He wasn't sure if he was talking to the dog or himself. He grabbed an old towel and started rubbing the shepherd's body, trying to get some warmth back into him. The dog whimpered softly, but didn't resist. That worried Daniel. Even a weak animal would usually show some fight. This one had almost given up. A sigh escaped Daniel as he ran a hand through his own disheveled hair. He hadn't planned on this. His life was already complicated enough without bringing in a half-dead stray. But now, as he watched the dog shiver, despite the growing heat in the cabin, he knew there was no turning back. He got up and walked into the kitchen, rummaging through his cabinets. He wasn't sure what a starving dog should eat, but he figured warm broth was a good start. He poured some into a bowl and set it down next to the shepherd. The dog lifted his head slightly, sniffing weakly, but made no effort to drink. "Come on, buddy," Daniel coaxed. "You gotta help me out here." Still, nothing. Daniel sighed and dipped his fingers into the warm liquid, then gently touched them to the dog's nose. The shepherd licked instinctively. That was something. Slowly, patiently, Daniel repeated the process until the dog finally managed a few small sips on his own. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give Daniel a sliver of hope. As the night went on, Daniel stayed by the dog's side. He wasn't sure why he cared so much. Maybe because, in some ways, he knew what it was like to be left out in the cold. His life hadn't exactly been easy. He'd spent years keeping his distance from people, choosing solitude over disappointment, and yet, here he was, sitting on the floor of his cabin, watching over a dog he didn't even know. The next morning, the shepherd was still alive, weak, but alive. Daniel studied him carefully as he stirred a fresh bowl of broth. The dog's eyes were slightly more alert now, though he still made no attempt to move. His body was covered in scars, some old, some fresher. Whoever had owned him before hadn't been kind. Daniel exhaled sharply. "You've been through more than just the cold, haven't you?" It made him angry. He didn't like thinking about what kind of person would do this to an animal. But anger wouldn't change anything. Right now, the only thing that mattered was getting this dog back on his feet. Days passed, and little by little, the shepherd grew stronger. He still had no collar, no identification. Daniel had checked lost pet reports, but there was nothing. No one seemed to be looking for him. One evening, as Daniel tossed another log into the fire, he heard a noise behind him. He turned to see the dog, standing, wobbly, weak, but standing. "Well, would you look at that?" Daniel said with a small grin. The shepherd took a shaky step forward. His eyes locked onto Daniel. And then, for the first time since that night in the snow, the dog wagged his tail. Just slightly, but it was there. Daniel shook his head, a strange warmth spreading in his chest. "Guess you're not giving up after all." It wasn't until later that Daniel realized something odd. The dog wasn't just recovering. He was watching, studying, learning, wherever he had come from, whatever his past was. This wasn't an ordinary stray. And soon, Daniel would find out just how much this dog was capable of. Because what happened next was something he never could have imagined. As the days passed, the German Shepherd, whom Daniel had started calling Rex, grew stronger. His limp disappeared. His fur began to regain its healthy shine. And his eyes, once dull and lifeless, now held a spark of alertness. But more than that, there was something different about him. He wasn't just recovering. He was watching, studying, as if he understood more than a regular dog should. At first, Daniel brushed it off. Maybe he was imagining things. But then small things started happening. Rex seemed to know Daniel's routine before he even moved, anticipating when he'd grab his coat, when he'd go to the kitchen, when he'd step outside. He followed Daniel's every movement with sharp focus. Learning without being taught. One night, Daniel was sitting on the couch, flipping through the TV channels, when he felt eyes on him. He turned his head to see Rex sitting near the door, ears perked, staring at him intently. "What?" Daniel muttered, raising an eyebrow. The dog didn't move. He just sat there, unmoving, waiting. Then, just as Daniel was about to look away, Rex let out a low growl. Daniel sat up. He had never heard Rex make a sound like that before. His hackles were raised slightly, his body tense. Then Daniel heard it, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps. Outside, his cabin was isolated, far from the main road, and visitors were rare, especially this late at night. His gut tightened as he stood, moving cautiously toward the window. Peering out, he saw nothing at first, just snow-covered trees and the soft glow of the moon against the landscape. But then, in the shadows near the tree line, something shifted. A figure. Daniel's mind raced. Was it someone lost? A hunter? Or something worse? His instincts told him to stay put. But before he could decide, Rex moved. The dog shot toward the door, his body alert, ready. That's when it hit Daniel. This wasn't just a stray dog. He had been trained. "Stay," Daniel whispered. But Rex was already ahead of him, muscles coiled. A sudden noise outside, this time closer. Daniel grabbed the flashlight from the shelf and slowly opened the door, stepping onto the porch. The freezing air hit him instantly, but he ignored it. His eyes scanned the darkness, heart pounding. Then a voice, low, gruff. "Didn't think anyone lived out here." Daniel tightened his grip on the flashlight. A man stepped out from the shadows, bundled in heavy clothing. His face was partially hidden under a hood, but something about him felt off. Before Daniel could respond, Rex growled again, stepping forward, placing himself between Daniel and the stranger. The man's eyes flicked to the dog, and for a split second, something flashed across his face. Recognition. That's when Daniel knew. This wasn't a coincidence. "Nice dog," the man said, his tone forced. "Didn't mean to scare you." Daniel didn't answer. His gut told him this guy knew exactly who Rex was. And if Rex had been abandoned, maybe it wasn't by accident. Maybe someone had left him out in the cold on purpose. Rex didn't take, his eyes off the man, his stance protective. Daniel took a slow breath, trying to stay calm. "You lost?" he asked, keeping his voice even. The man hesitated. "Just passing through," he muttered. Then, after a moment, he took a step back. "Didn't mean to bother you." He turned and disappeared into the darkness, his footprints vanishing quickly under the falling snow. Daniel waited listening until the night was silent again. Only then did he exhale. Rex relaxed slightly, but didn't move from his position. until Daniel finally shut the door. For a long moment, Daniel just stood there, staring at the dog. "Who are you, really?" he murmured. Rex didn't answer, of course. But somehow Daniel knew. This dog had a past, one that someone wanted to erase, and they had almost succeeded. But now Rex had a future. By morning, the night's events felt almost unreal, but Daniel knew better. He had seen the way that man looked at Rex, the way Rex had responded. Someone had trained this dog for something, and someone had left him for dead. But Rex had survived. And now, whatever life he had before, it didn't matter. That day, Daniel took Rex into town for the first time. The dog walked beside him, strong, confident, no longer the weak, shivering animal Daniel had found in the snow. People turned to look, some stopping to admire the shepherd, asking questions about where he had come from. Daniel kept the answers vague. He wasn't sure what the full story was, but he knew one thing. Rex wasn't going anywhere. As they headed back to the cabin, Daniel glanced down at him. "Guess we're stuck with each other now, huh?" he said with a small smile. Rex looked up, his tail wagging slightly, as if he understood, and in that moment, Daniel realized something. Maybe he hadn't saved Rex that night in the snow. Maybe, in a way, Rex had saved him too.